Hello there, my name is Saumya and I'm a PhD student at the CSIR National Institute of Oceanography in Goa. Today, I'm going to tell you an exciting story from the Arabian Sea. A couple of years ago, a bunch of scientists jumped onto a ship to study the fish found all along the west coast of India. Interestingly, they noticed a pattern. Most of the big fish in the north ate other small fish and hence were carnivores, whereas in the south, most of the fish fed on phytoplankton and hence are called planktivores. Think of them as the vegetarians that you might know, who primarily depend on plants for their food. Now what are phytoplanktons, you may ask? So just like the other trees and plants you see on land, phytoplankton are the plants of the ocean. In a way that they utilize sunlight to perform photosynthesis and hence prepare food for other organisms at the sea. But unlike the trees and the plants that you can see on land with your naked eyes, phytoplankton are not visible with your naked eyes. So, in most cases, we require a microscope to see these organisms clearly. But despite their tiny size, these organisms are highly effective in taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and releasing back oxygen. Did you know? About 50% of the oxygen that we breathe comes from the oceans via these organisms. These organisms take up carbon dioxide because carbon atoms form the building blocks of life on Earth. Carbon is essential for molecules like fats, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, etc. The carbon atoms found on the Earth are of a few different types. The two most stable ones, that is the ones that stay for a really long time on Earth, are carbon-12 and carbon-13. The fundamental difference between the two is an extra particle called neutron in carbon-13. This particle makes carbon-13 slightly heavier than carbon-12. But if you were to look at all the atoms of carbon on Earth, most of them would be carbon-12 and only very few, about 1.1% of them would be carbon-13. Well, how does it matter if it's carbon-12 or carbon-13? After all, carbon is just carbon. Well, this simple difference between carbon-12 and carbon-13 makes for a very powerful tool in helping us identify different things. Let's go ahead and see how. Now, since carbon-13 is slightly heavier than carbon-12, most of the organisms have to put in a little bit more energy to take up carbon-13 atoms. So depending upon their energy resources, the organisms might take up carbon-12 and carbon-13 in different amounts. Now, for every 100 carbon-12 atoms, grass might have X carbon-13 atoms, a tree might have Y carbon-13 atoms, and a phytoplankton might have Z carbon-13 atoms. Well, over the years, the scientists have figured out exactly what X, Y, and Z are. So, I go out in my garden and I pick up a handful of soil. In that soil, I find some plant residue, but I'm unable to identify it, whether it's a part of a broken leaf or it's a blade of a grass. So I take it back to my lab and I check for carbon-12 and carbon-13 atoms. I find Y carbon-13 atoms. So now I know that it's definitely a broken part of a leaf. Now that we know a little about carbon-12 and carbon-13 and we know that they can be utilized to identify the residue, let's go back to the Arabian Sea. So I hope you remember the distinct pattern in the fish that was found along the west coast of India. So my lab people and I went to the Arabian Sea in August to look at why that was happening. So first of all, we decided to look at the food of the fish, which is nothing but the residue of phytoplankton. And interestingly, we found that the phytoplankton residue in south had a lot more heavier carbon-13 atoms, and that was our first clue. So the different carbon-13 atoms in the south and the north tell us that the food was coming from two different sources. Just like our balanced diet, phytoplankton require nutrients. Think of nutrients as the gold coins. The phytoplankton in the south had a lot more gold coins as compared to the poorer phytoplankton in the north. Now because in the south they're richer, they can afford a lot more carbon-12 chocolates and easily also afford the expensive carbon-13 chocolates, whereas the poor phytoplankton in the north can buy fewer chocolates and only on special occasions get the expensive carbon-13 chocolates. Now because of all those gold coins and chocolates, the phytoplankton in the south grow up to be big and healthy. Because of that, they can be easily spotted by big fish and can be eaten directly by them. But the tiny malnourished phytoplankton of the north is difficult to be spotted by big fish. So they're first eaten by smaller organisms or smaller fish who are eventually eaten by the big fish, and hence the chain here is carnivores.